I'm Katrina Walser from Oliphant Cat, and if we haven't met before, I am a knitting teacher and designer based in Sydney, Australia. But if this isn't the first video of mine you've seen, welcome back. I'm here today with a tutorial about slip stitches and specifically how to use them to do colour work. So slip stitch knitting is a particular type of colour work that I really love because it's a type of colour work that only needs you to hold one strand at a time, and so it's a lot easier than trying to do Fair Isle, but it still looks just as striking. So the basis of slip stitch knitting is actually stripes. At the end of the day, all slip stitch colour work is a series of fancy looking stripes. So if you haven't worked with two colours before, or if you just don't know how to make stripes, I'd recommend you go back to the previous video and have a watch of that just as a refresher or an intro on how to knit stripes, because you'll need that for this. But if you've got that all down pat and you're confident enough in how to actually use two colours in your work on alternating rows, then let's just get to it and I will show you how to do slip stitch colour work. Okay, so we're going to keep using the swatch from the last video. So I'm going to start using the dark blue colour. And we're essentially just going to begin knitting a stripe, but the stripe is going to have some slip stitches in it, and that's how you do slip stitch colour work. First off, I'm just going to knit a stitch and then I'll show you how to slip stitches. So a slip stitch is just a stitch that you don't actually knit. All you do is that you insert the right hand needle into the stitch and you just pull it off without actually knitting it. So insert your needle into the stitch and just pull it off. And that's it, you've slipped a stitch. There are two things you need to watch when you slip your stitches. The first is which direction you are inserting your needle. So to slip your stitch, you can insert your right hand needle purlwise like you're about to purl, or knitwise from front to back like you're about to knit. In slip stitch colour work, you're always going to be inserting it purlwise. If you insert it knitwise, that's what gives you what's called a twisted stitch, which is still a technique that people use in knitting, but it's not the look that we're after here. Secondly, unless the pattern tells you otherwise, make sure that the yarn that you're knitting with stays in the back when you slip your stitch on the right side row, and then it moves to the front when you slip your stitch on the wrong side row. And I'll show you a little bit more about that when we actually get to a wrong side row. But for now, we're just going to keep knitting and then slipping alternating stitches to the end of the row. And so if we look now at our knitting, we have alternating stitches of blue and then green. So if we take this back a little bit, I'll show you how it's actually working. So when you knit a stitch, you insert a new loop around, and this new loop here is what forms a new row. So you're adding an extra set of loops above the old set of loops, and that's how you make another row of knitting. But when you slip a stitch, you aren't actually adding any new loops. So you're basically using this stitch from the previous row and just moving it onto the right hand needle. And because you've changed colours, the previous row was the old colour, so when you slip your stitch over, it stays that colour. And then when you knit the next stitch, it changes colour. And again, when you slip the stitch after that, it stays the old colour, and you just keep going down until the end. And so that's what it looks like, and that's how slip stitch colour work works. Now the thing that you have to keep in mind with this is that because you're slipping these stitches and you aren't actually adding a whole extra row's worth of yarn in, you're essentially stretching this stitch over multiple rows. In this case it's two. So if you take a look really carefully down here, this green stitch here and this blue stitch here, they're two separate rows. But this green one, because it belonged to this green row, and you haven't added in any blue stitches, it's sort of stretched and it's as tall as two separate stitches. It doesn't look super stretched, it's not very obvious just when you look at it. But it does mean that it can change your gauge quite a bit. So your gauge when you do slip stitch knitting, even though it looks like normal stockinette that just has some color work in it, it actually isn't exactly the same as normal stockinette because you have all of these stretched out stitches. So make sure that you make a swatch and that you actually block the swatch and that you measure your gauge after you block the swatch because slip stitch knitting can change quite a bit in size after you block it. For the next row, we're just going to purl our way across the back using the dark blue. Okay, so in slip stitch knitting, in most cases you'll be changing colours every second row. So we're going to change to the light blue now. And this is actually the pattern that we're going to be using, so we'll just do a couple more rows of it. And if you aren't used to using a chart, don't worry, I'm just going to read it out to you. So we're now at the start of row 3. So in the light blue, I'm going to knit my first 2 stitches, and then I'm going to slip a stitch, and then knit 1, and then slip 1, and then knit 1, and keep doing that. So again, when you slip, make sure you insert your needle purlwise, and you keep the yarn in the back. Slip, knit, slip, knit, slip, knit, all the way down to the end of the row. So this is what our pattern looks like. It's starting to actually show up as a pattern. And then on the wrong side row, the next row, which is row 4, I'll show you what a slip stitch looks like on the wrong side. So when you slip a stitch on the wrong side, you still slip it purlwise, but you keep the yarn here in the front. And then we're going to purl 3, and I'll show you another slip stitch. So to slip the stitch, insert the needle purlwise, and keep the working yarn here in the front. Don't go ahead and move it to the back like you would on a right side row. So I'm just going to keep doing that pattern all the way down to the end of the row. And so this is what it looks like now, at the end of row 4. So the main advantage of slip stitch knitting is that you're only ever using one strand at a time. So if you're doing this as stranded colour work, you'd have to carry the light blue and the dark blue with you all along the row, but because we're doing this as slip stitches, you're just using the one strand. So we only had to use the light blue, and that's why I call them fancy stripes. So they are essentially just stripes, so in this case, it's a stripe of this light blue. So here's our 2 rows of light blue. You just happen to be pulling some of the stitches up from the previous row, and that's how you get the slip stitch colour work. So if you didn't actually have the beginning of a swatch here, if you were just starting this from scratch, then when you start a new colour, you do what we did in the last video, and you just join the yarn on like it was the beginning of a stripe, and then you work from there. So if we were to finish this swatch, this is actually what it ends up looking like. So this is from a pattern of mine called Slips and Splotches, which is a baby blanket, and that's what it looks like in the end. So some of those stitches do get a little bit big. If you look at that there, you can definitely see that it's a little stretched out. So I personally don't mind the look of it. I know some people don't love it though, so it's up to you. I personally think that the way that it looks is sort of cool, and it's so much less hassle than trying to do stranded colour work. So any variations in the texture more than make up for how easy it is to knit and how good it looks. So I wanted to show you a couple of other things that you can do with slip stitches. First off, when I said earlier that these stitches get stretched along multiple rows, you can actually use that fact to your advantage. So if you look at this hexagon swatch here, it actually looks like you've done something fancy to make the hexagons. But actually all it is that these grey rows are just 2 rows of gutter stitch. And then you switch to the yellow and you do about 6 rows of the yellow. But at these points, you slip the 2 stitches there, all the way up the 6 rows of yellow. And what that actually does is that it warps the material in interesting ways. Because these 2 stitches here, you're essentially stretching them across 6 rows of knitting, and it's really just not possible for a single stitch to stretch to be as tall as 6 whole rows. And so that's how you get this hexagon shape, because the slip stitches are pulling the grey rows in at the point at which you've slipped the stitches. So I think that's just a neat little swatch. And then you can also do slip stitches to create texture. So this isn't slip stitch color work anymore, it just becomes a slip stitch pattern, but this is a handy trick for variegated yarn. So the thing that I find with variegated yarn is that it can be difficult to get a stitch pattern that works nicely with it, because variegated yarn can be so busy that any texture you try and add with pearls or anything can get quite lost with the busyness of the colour. But I really like using slip stitches with variegated yarns because it just creates a subtle sort of texture that you don't have to pay too much attention to, but it works nicely. And obviously this is very highly variegated yarn, but if you use it with something that's a little more subtle, then you can see the texture a bit better. So if you've ever got a variegated yarn and you don't know what to do with it, go try and find a pattern that uses slip stitches because they do show off the yarn quite well. And the last thing that I wanted to show you is some linen stitch. So this isn't slip stitch color work, this is intarsia, so let's just ignore the color work sections. But if we just look at the brown bit right here, this is a very common stitch called linen stitch. And when I was saying earlier that you want to make sure that you hold the yarn in the back when you slip a stitch on the right side row and hold it in the front on a wrong side row, this is actually the opposite. As I've been knitting, when I slip my stitches, I hold the yarn in the front on the wrong side row, and that's how you get these little bars running across the front. And so you can get some pretty cool textures like that, and this is what it looks like on the wrong side. So that's my intro to slip stitch color work. I hope you have a decent idea now of how it works. Go give it a try, and if you are looking for a beginner pattern to try out your newfound skills with, give slips and splotches a look. It is a pattern of mine, you can find it on Ravelry on Etsy, and it's a good beginner piece because it's just a rectangle, so you don't have to worry about any shaping or anything. And if you aren't used to reading charts, it does actually have a written out version of the pattern that tells you when to knit and when to slip and stuff, so you can use that version instead. I just use the chart because it's what I find easier to read. If you do go ahead and try this out, regardless of what the pattern is, please let me know. I love seeing people's projects, especially when they're trying something new, because I get really excited for people when they learn new skills. And so the easiest of doing that is I'm Oliphant Cat on Instagram, so just find me there and either tag me on any pictures of your work or DM me so I can see your progress and the things you've been doing with the slip stitches. So for the next video we'll be doing mosaic knitting, which is a particular type of slip stitch knitting. So come back for that when you're ready, but otherwise just go forth and knit some slip stitches. Happy knitting!